Earlier today, stakeholders met in Pretoria to discuss possible solutions to the scourge of violence in schools and our communities. National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa, NAPTOSA, the Catholic Institute of Education and others have identified dysfunctional families and drug abuse among the issues influencing violent behavior. The briefing comes after the stabbing to death of a 16-year-old Forest High School learner about 2 weeks ago. 2 other learners were also attacked and hospitalised. Joining us now to take the discussion further from our studios in Pretoria is Cullen Mackenzie. He is Knowledge and Research Manager from the Catholic Institute of Education. Good afternoon to you and thank you so much for coming through, Mr. Mackenzie. A lot of experts saying that violence in school is not necessarily a new phenomenon. It's always been there.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me on your show. It's certainly not anything new. I think that at the moment social media means that we see more and more videos coming up of school violence, and we see teacher on learner violence, we see learner on learner violence and learner on teacher. And I think that it's something which has a long history, and it is in fact the manifestation of deep trauma that exists in our society and similar societies.
And on Sunday, on Youth Day, we had all the stakeholders in the education sector, the department, the unions representing the teachers, unions representing the learners and education psychologists. And the question that I asked them is, what is the root cause of this violence? Before we can try to come up with solutions, do we really know what the problem may be?
I think we do. We have some idea. We have windows into understanding what the causes might be. There are some really big causes, and they go back quite a long time. So there's inequality, which as a very root cause contributes to the way that a person perceives themselves and the way that they perceive others. I think that the history of oppression here in South Africa, and particularly repression and oppression on the grounds of colour or gender or language, means that there is a climate which has an overwhelming negative sentiment, and that all feeds into increased pressure that people are experiencing on a daily basis. Economic pressure, pressure to make ends meet, to provide for their families, and all of this built on the foundation of institutionalized punitive systems, where what we're talking about is people's dignity not being important, where the learners are not being valued as human beings. They're not being cared for because the teachers are also not being cared for or valued. And so it becomes a vicious cycle. There's a feedback loop, a negative feedback loop that leads to this overwhelming upwelling of violence in society. And I think that what's particularly interesting is the fact that this all occurs within a system where there is structural violence. And what I mean by that is, even though all the laws that made up apartheid and all the laws that made up the previous systems have been abolished, the residue, the trace of that violence remains. And it means that people see that the only solution to any challenge that they face is violence. And it's because there are many examples where a struggle or a fight has led to a solution. But in the end, violence only begets violence. And I think that it's almost like we give into it because it's what we know, it's what we do, it's been normalized.
Yeah. And part of what other people are saying is that there is some sort of lack of parenting skills in parents who do not necessarily get involved in their children's daily activities, for example, maybe to a number of reasons, including working early and finishing late at work. But one of the issues that were identified at your meeting today as may be contributing to this problem is dysfunctional families and drug abuse.
I think that the issue of families is interesting because there are amazing support networks that exist. And I think that thinking in narrow terms of a nuclear family, you know, mother present, father present, living in a single house, is also not an African model. Quite often it is the extended family that looks after the child. But those extended families still need to be functional. So whether we're talking about a mother and a father, or whether we're talking about ubaba gekho, you know, father's not around, as an issue, the parents or the people looking after that child after school do need the skills to not deal with, but to relate to their children, to understand them, to restore them, to do that in a manner which actually values their dignity and doesn't humiliate them or punish them. Because punishing someone just leads to more broken people, and that's not what we need. I think that the drug abuse angle of it is interesting because quite often, I mean, what people don't think about is that drugs are they're a way of numbing, they're a way of escaping.
The pain.
And I think that people are turning to drugs because they see a reality which has no hope for them. They do not see a way that they can be that could actually be peaceful and productive and contribute to society. So they check out. But it does mean that the drugs have added criminal elements to them. So there is gangsterism. The drugs do lead to feuds.
Creates
they lead
more problems.
It creates more problems in the schools. But I think that blaming one thing or another is not useful in this instance, because it's actually just it's a general societal dis-ease. There's something that we're seeing the symptoms. The symptoms are drug abuse. The symptoms are dysfunctional families. The symptoms are growing violence. And we need to stop treating the symptoms and actually look for the root and see how we can treat the basis of it.
Yes, indeed. A lot of people saying that it's a societal problem and therefore requires a societal approach. Many thanks there to my guest, Cullen Mackenzie, Knowledge and Research Manager from the Catholic Institute of Education. They had a summit and a meeting earlier today looking into violence in schools. And of course, they've identified dysfunctional families and drug abuse as some of the reasons or contributing factors really to this problem.